Hey everybody, hope you're all doing well. I wanted to cover the concept of pre-bolusing today, just introducing it as a thing, explaining how I use it in my own life to manage my blood sugar and my response to food, and hopefully giving you some information that if you don't have it yet, is something that you can actually start to do some more research on. Ask your doctor about it. I would definitely go to the Juicebox podcast, who has an extensive series on this. It's really the foundation of everything that they do. I can't tell you what to do as, I'm not a medical professional, but this concept of pre-bolusing, which really just means taking your insulin at certain times before your food to match up the effectiveness, it has changed the game for me. I recently got an A1C of 5.1 with like 98% time in range. It's really because of my understanding of this. Um, Scott on the Juicebox podcast, he always has this analogy of like a tug of war in terms of the insulin versus the food anytime you eat a meal. So you always want to have a tug of war with the insulin pulling the blood sugar down on one end of that rope and the food trying to pull the blood sugar up on the other end of that rope. And really the goal with all diabetes management is to make sure that nobody wins that war. Like that's something that you want to stay level until the insulin and the food effects both dissipate. So understanding how to pre-bolus really means understanding how your insulin is working and when it's going to be most effective in your body and matching that up against the food that you're eating so that you can sort of counteract those two things. Again, think about that rope. You want nobody to win that tug of war. You want to make it same so that they're both pulling on exactly the same amount and your blood sugar stays as stable as can be. So I have a graph that I just found online. I want to show it in share my screen just to talk through this because I think it'll make a little bit more sense if I show it. So let me just share actually my Photoshop. Okay, hopefully you can see my screen here. This is just a chart of different types of fast-acting insulin and how they work over time. So on the left here would be the insulin effectiveness. So as this line goes up, this would be like the peak of the effectiveness of this insulin. In this case, it's like the solid purple line. It would be Lumjev. So this is like an ultra fast-acting insulin. You can see that within about 30 to 45 minutes, this insulin has peaked in terms of its effectiveness or how powerfully it's going to be lowering your blood sugar. And after that, it starts to slowly dissipate. Now, this is slightly different for each person, but in general, I think this is what shows up in a lot of studies. This is a cool chart because it shows different types of insulin. Now, I take Humalog, so in this case, it would be like the dark purple. And it looks like that one goes right here. So it's a little bit of a slower onset. And then it sort of peaks at around an hour and 20 minutes, hour and a half, and then it comes down. Now, the reason this is important is because when you first take your insulin, you have to understand how fast or how slow the food that you're eating is also going to affect you. For example, if you were to eat a meal and take your insulin right with that food, if the food, let's say you're eating a bowl of Cheerios, which is a very high glycemic index food, which is something that we can get into another time as well. That those Cheerios might spike your blood sugar from the minute that you eat them. And if the insulin has not started working yet, it's going to actually just keep rising. So what I like to think about is this. So I'm just going to add another layer here. So let's pretend that I'm going to do a little bit of drawing on this thing. Let's pretend that this green line is the food that you eat. And here is the insulin that you take. So we're at zero. The insulin is not yet in my body. Neither is the food. If I was to eat a food like Cheerios, it might actually spike my blood sugar like this. So it might almost go straight up and then come down like this. So in this case, if I had eaten that bowl of Cheerios and taken the insulin at the same time, the Cheerio impact would be peaking before the insulin impact was peaking. What would generally happen here is that I'm going to see my blood sugar skyrocket, and I'm going to have to be chasing it and correcting it later. Because if you think about that tug of war, in this case, the food won because it hit my bloodstream so much faster than the insulin did that I had no chance. Now, the concept of a pre-bolus comes in that. So pre-bolus means, so bolus means to eat. And so if you're pre-bolusing, it essentially means you know what you're going to eat. You have an understanding based on experience or the glycemic index of that food or that meal in terms of how it's going to hit you. And then you adjust when you take the insulin appropriately. So for example, let's say I was still using this Lumjev insulin here, and I wanted the peak to actually be closer to when the Cheerios were going to hit peak. I would take my insulin probably 5 to 10 minutes before I actually had those Cheerios, depending on where my blood sugar was beforehand. And that's really just what a pre-bolus is. It's timing up these peaks. Let's look at another example. So if, on the other hand, I was going to take, let's say I was going to eat something more complex, like let's say I was going to eat pizza. Now, the impact of pizza is not really what you may think because it's a lot of fat. So generally, for a lot of people, it digests pretty slowly. So let's say, again, I ate some pizza. My pizza might actually want to hit my bloodstream kind of like this. And it might level off for a little bit, and then it might go up again. That's generally how pizza at least would hit me. So in this case, you can see that really my bloodstream or the blood sugar is not going to have a significant push up right away because there's so much fat and protein in that meal that it's generally causing the digestion to be slower. And so in this case, if I pre-bolused, I might actually go low because if I took the insulin before I ate that meal, I would have that peak kind of right around here or even back here when the food was barely even hitting me. And so with pizza, it's kind of a complicated meal to eat, but a lot of times with pizza, I'll take half of the insulin when I first have the pizza, and then maybe I'll take another dose in 2 or even 4 hours to match up those peaks. The whole idea with pre-bolusing is you want the food lines to match up with the insulin lines as much as possible. So like this. So the idea would be understand the glycemic index of your food, meaning how quickly is it going to raise your blood sugar, and then match that up against the insulin. So I think about this all the time. It's kind of a foundation of what I do in terms of blood sugar management. And it really does make a difference because you end up, if you do it well, what you generally see is a slight increase after you eat and then a leveling off and a lack of correction. That's a huge thing too. If you take your insulin at the wrong time and you let your blood sugar kind of get out of control, in many cases, you're going to hope that it comes down, but it may not. And then you're going to have to take a correction in a couple of hours. Now, for me, that could often cause lows because by the time I take that correction, then the correction hits, meaning the correction gets stronger and it's functioning to bring down my blood sugar at its best. A lot of the food is digested by that point. And so I would then see a significant drop where I might have to correct with some sugar or some juice or something. So the better you can figure out the timing of this pre-bolus, the less you're going to have to do that. And it's really going to help you take less insulin overall because you're not going to be chasing a high. You're not going to be correcting a low. So you're not, hopefully, if you do it right, you're not going to take as much insulin and you're also not going to have to correct as often as you may. So like I said, these impacts will differ for everybody, but it's really helpful for you to get an understanding of when your insulin seems to be working the best in your body and then contrasting that and timing it appropriately with the food. So there's a ton more that we can get into with this concept, but that's it for now. I don't want to make this too complicated or too overwhelming, but basically the moral of the story is try to time up the impact of your food and the impact of your insulin. The more you can get those two graphs to overlap, the better of an experience you're going to have. So I'll stop there. Let me know if this is helpful and we can get into it more in future videos. Thanks.